Hello every pony, Dash Assault here. Today we'll be vectoring eyes and eyelashes in part 2 of my tutorial series. Now, to actually work on eyes here, you could use the ellipse tool. I noticed when I first opened Inkscape today that when I drew my figure that nothing showed up here. The reason for that is because I don't have any stroke and no fill selected for this object. Every object in Inkscape can have a fill and a stroke. If you select a fill here and a stroke here, then you can see the object isn't actually blank. That's just a little bit of a warning because I didn't expect that when I first opened it. So what you can do is you can take your ellipse here and you can kind of try and reposition it and kind of rotate it to try and get it to almost look like this figure here properly. But it's a lot of work to do that, and I've spent a lot of time in the past trying to do it. It just doesn't work out very well. There's actually a much easier way to do that, and that's to use this transform here called ellipse by 5 points. I'll include the link in the bottom of the description. Alternately, you could also use a tool called Ponyscape. I haven't used it myself, but apparently there's some people over here that are crazy about ponies who decided to take Inkscape and add some functions like this ellipse by 5 points function. You could try it out yourself. Let me know how it goes. All right, back to vectoring ponies here. So what we're going to do is we're going to select the Bezier Curves tool. We're going to look at our circles here. We're going to select 5 points on the circle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hit enter to get the shape. We don't really care what the shape looks like here. We only care about where the points are. We just want the points to lie along the curve of the circle. Then we'll go up to our extensions, generate from path, ellipse from 5 points, and you'll get something that looks like that, which is a pretty close approximation of that eye shine there. So we'll continue on. We'll do it on this guy. Boop. That looks pretty good too, so we'll just continue on. We're going to have to do a little bit of guessing here because we don't quite know where that circle is, but we can get a pretty good guess. That doesn't look too bad. We can continue on. 2, 3, 4, 5. Again, you notice I don't really care where I put those points. That's kind of a large circle. We might need to fiddle with it just a little bit, perhaps. That's probably going to be good enough. These things don't have to be perfect. And also bear in mind when you're doing this, the circle can absolutely be larger than where you're working. So that's not our problem. Let's continue on again here. We're going to make a few guesses. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, and so we've got our curve there for the eye white as well. That's where everything's going to connect into. Now, one of the things to be aware of on these eyes is they've got kind of these two different eye colors here. You can see in the color guide that clearly they're also represented as well. A lot of people forget to put these eye colors in when they're drawing ponies, but if you want to make your pony show accurate, you're definitely going to want to have them. Another thing to be aware of is that usually in a lot of ponies, this eye area outside here, outside the eye colors, is actually gradient. It goes from one color to another, so it's darker up here and lighter down here. A lot of people also forget that there's a gradient in there, but we won't forget that. We'll make it happen. So how do we deal with these triangles in here? Because it can be kind of irritating. Usually what I do is I kind of figure out where this is going to go inside the eye. And I draw a big old triangle here, like that. Then what we'll do is we'll create a point right in here in the center that kind of lines up with that line through the center. And then what I like to do is duplicate this shape. You have two ways of doing that. You can either go to edit and say duplicate, or you can hit Control D. I'm used to the shortcut, so I usually hit Control D. So we've duplicated it. Now we have a second figure on top of the one before. You can tell that that's the case by moving this point around. There's actually a second figure underneath it. Control Z to go back. And they're actually laying on top of each other. So what we're going to do is we're going to make two triangles out of the one triangle I had originally. I'll take this point here, I'll delete it. Now you've got this kind of weird curve thing going on. Then I'll select the 2 points here in my triangle, and I'll click corner node. What this is going to do is it's going to make these act as sharp corners and force the lines to go directly between these points. So we'll click that. Now we've got one half of our triangle. But that's not the whole triangle. See, we've got this triangle over here, but this is still the large triangle over there. And what we want is we want the other half of this triangle. So we want to cut this one in half too. So we repeat the same process, doing it the other way around, hit this guy, and that lines it up. So now we've got the exact two triangles we want to have here. That's cool. Now we've got everything outlined in this eye. Excellent. So now we'll start coloring things. So we'll select this point here, and we'll say this guy actually should be white. So we'll get fill color. We'll see that this is white. You'll note that in the RGBA format here, these Fs right here, they're all Fs. That represents white. These last two here represents the alpha transparency, which corresponds to this here, which we don't really care about changing, so usually always leave that FF. We don't want to have this outline here, which is black, so we'll go over to stroke paint and turn that off. So now you just have a white circle. We want this guy to be exactly the same as this circle, so we'll copy this guy, Control C, and we'll paste style, Control Shift V. And what that does is effectively paste in the same color characteristics so they look the same. Okay, that's all well and good. Now we want this guy to be black. So we'll fill that. Oops, it's white. Well, I know personally that if I delete this and I change these to all zeros, that's actually going to be black. You leave the last two FFs because that, again, controls the alpha transparency. We don't want to muck with that because that just makes it transparent. You could muck with that if you're trying to get a transparency going on here, but we don't want that here. Again, we have that extra stroke paint on the exterior of the circle we're going to get rid of. That makes the circle slightly smaller, but we'll note that when we actually hide the layer, we'll see that that actually does match up. But now you're asking, okay, what happened to my eye whites there? I actually want them to show up. What you can do is you want to lower this object. You can either hit page down, and it'll lower it one at a time, or you can hit the N key, which will lower it to the bottom. This is kind of the same as saying raise, lower, or raise the top, lower to bottom. This is basically controls how the objects in your current layer operate. It's basically a Z scale operation. Again, we'll see that these guys are kind of a little bit on top, so we'll lower them a little bit, make sure that these other objects lay on top of them. And we kind of see, well, that eye white, well, it's not quite right because it should be a little bit larger than this black object. So maybe we'll make this guy a little bit smaller, make this guy just a tad larger, and then it kind of overlaps a little bit better versus how the original picture looked. All right, this guy is going to be a little more complicated because we're going to need our gradient on here. So let's go back and look at the eye color here. This color guide here is basically saying there's 3 different colors in the gradient from the lightest to the darkest. We'll note over here that the darkest part of this is at the top, lightest part is at the bottom. So that's the way we're going to run this gradient. So we'll select this this figure here. You'll note that the fill doesn't have any color. We'll give it a color, but now it's all black, which is not really what we want. We'll hit N to move that to the bottom. But we don't really want black. We want that 3-color gradient. So we click on the linear gradient button, and you'll see it's got different colors of blackness. It's got this gradient going on here. You'll see you've got the gradient here. We'll actually click the edit button. This will allow us to bring the gradient editor up. It's got these 2 stops in here. What this really means is, well, this is going to be the color at this end. This stop's going to be the color at that end. So it basically goes from black to alpha transparent, which means there's no color at all. It's just missing. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our color guide. Our color guide says 186F98. 186F98. So that's going to be our first color. Our last color is going to be 82D1F4. 82D1F4. We don't want it transparent, so we'll leave this at FF. And now we've got our 2-color gradient. One's dark and the other's light. But that's not quite right because we need a 3rd color, so we say add stop. And so we have 3 stops. We have this one, which is our 186 color. We have this stop, which is our 82D1 color. And we have this middle stop, which it just tried to interpolate as a kind of a middle color, but we want to actually make it 489 3B3. Okay, so now we've got our gradient. The cool thing about this is that it'll actually record this as a particular gradient, and then later on, if you want to apply that gradient to other objects, you can just select gradient and then select that gradient we just made here, which is cool because we'll be wanting to do that again later, but not exactly on this object, so we'll turn that back off. Now you notice I've got my gradient flipped here, which isn't exactly what I want. I want the dark one on the top and the light one at the bottom. If you can hide that, you can clearly see that's pretty much how we want to do it. So we go over back to the Edit Paths by Nose button, and we'll see this extra line in the center of our circle. What this line corresponds to is our gradient. So we can drag this guy around and say, okay, I want the light side of the gradient to be over here somewhere, and the dark side to be up top somewhere. And you can play around with this any way you want to play around with it to make the gradient look right. So we'll see that, oh, well, that's kind of dark up there. We want it maybe lighter over this direction to follow that more linearly. Maybe it needs a little bit lighter near the center, so we can move this up a little bit. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be good enough. Make it so that you're happy with it. Once you're happy with it, you can stop. I think that's good enough. Again, we're going to turn off the stroke paint on the outside, so now we've got our gradient. But we're not quite done yet. We still need those outer two colors here. This is where it gets interesting because we'll be using one of my tricks to make it work properly. First, we're going to set the colors for these guys. We'll set the fill color, and we'll see here we should have the lighter one and then the darker one. So the darker one should be A2DEF8. Turn off our stroke paint. And the lower one should be E1F4FD. You'll see I've made a mistake here. I actually put the color in my stroke paint instead of my fill paint. That's okay. You're going to make mistakes. You can fix them. So now we'll see what's gone on here is we've got our triangles, but they're clearly outside of this bounded box here where our gradient is, which is definitely a problem because that just looks goofy. We don't want those outside. So what we're going to do is we're going to use what we call a mask to mask this off to match this here. So to do that, we're going to duplicate this object, Control D. So now we have a duplicate on top. I don't really care about this one being filled. I do want to have a stroke on it so I can see what color it is. And in fact, I'm going to make this black so I can see what it is. It's basically another object, so you'll note that if I move it around, it isn't actually replacing the object below it, it's just a duplicate of it. So what I do is now I select this object, I select that object, and I select that object. So that's 3 objects. And then I right-click on my lower object, and I say Set Clip. Bonk. What does that do? Well, that basically said this object here is now going to be only the interior of the uppermost object will be shown from the lower object. So let's reiterate that again. It's a little bit confusing. So whichever object is on top, so for example, if we duplicate this guy again, whichever object's on top, because basically when you duplicate an object, it gets moved to the top. I'm going to remove that again. Whichever object is on top is going to describe the area within which the object you're clipping lives. So that actually means that, I mean, notwithstanding the fact that it doesn't look quite right, if we turn the lower layer off, you'll see that it actually neatly folds these objects into this middle object here. So you don't have to do a lot of extra work to try and make it look right. It just looks right. You're basically done. Hooray. So now we're going to use the same trick again to fix this outer circle. So we'll take this guy, we're going to make him white. Woohoo. He's not right. We'll hit the N key to move him to the bottom. We'll turn off the stroke paint. So now you've got your eye white. It's almost starting to look like an eye. Then we'll take this object, we'll duplicate it with Control D. We'll put a stroke on it and turn the fill off so we can see what we're doing. This object is now at the top. We're going to take this lower object and we're going to select the upper object. We're going to right click on the lower object and we're going to hit Set Clip. And what this will do is, again, the same thing. Basically, we've taken this lower eye gradient and we've clipped it with the upper object. So now all we see of this object is what's interior to that object. That still looks a little weird, but that's just because we don't have the eyelashes in place there. Once we get the eyelashes in place, that'll all be covered up and it'll all look much nicer. So let's work on the eyelashes. The easiest way to do that is just to turn the eye layer off entirely, because you don't really want to see anything extraneous when you're working on something else. We'll go to the eyelashes layer. We'll select the Bezier Curves tool. Click way down there at the tip, and then we'll click way up here at this tip. Hit enter. And then we're going to go back to bending lines again. Pretty much exactly what you have to do everywhere in Inkscape to make this look right. This will take a little while to get right. Just kind of bend it, make it look right. That's not too awful. That's okay. So I'm going to use my B shortcut key here now to speed up my curves. So I got the Bezier Curves tool again. But as you see, I want to draw these eyelashes in as well. But to do that, I want it to meet up with this other curve that I already drew. The easiest way to do that is to use the snapping tool over here. So you've got this snapping thing. You can turn it on and off, and you'll definitely want to be able to turn that off sometimes. And then I usually select the snappers up here. Because that allows me to do is when I just kind of highlight over an existing object, I'll say handle to path. And what that means is when you click here, it'll automatically create the node on that previous object you've drawn. It makes it a lot easier to match stuff up and make stuff meet up properly. So I'm just going to draw the line there. I'm going to draw one here. And then I'm going to kind of bend them to make them look kind of right. That's not quite right. See, we have this problem here with the snapping because it wants to snap to the end node, and we don't really want it to do that. So what I'll do is I'll turn snapping off. I'll kind of move it up there to kind of match where I want it to be, and then we'll do that. And then that's just good enough. Cool. And now we'll draw lines for these guys too. These guys are going to be a little tricky because they're basically going to be, this layer is on top of the eye layer, but we want these to meet up directly with kind of the eyeball there. But that's okay. We can fix that manually. I'll show you how to do that in a little bit. All right, we've got the base of the eyebrow drawn now. So what we're going to do now is what we did in the first tutorial. So we're going to kind of change the width here until it matches up. 5 looks kind of right. These guys too, and we'll say, oh, 5's okay. And we'll do a Control-C, Control-Shift-V to make them all the same size. And now what I'll do is what I did with the ear parts here, is I'm going to change these strokes here to objects. And stroke to path, Control-Alt-C. Now it's an object. And what we're going to need to do here is we're going to need to kind of have it match up with what we're seeing down there. So we're going to want to delete this, kind of move this to the point over here, make that line up, drag this guy up. We'll make this guy a smooth node to try and smooth everything out, make it a little bit nicer. That seems to look almost okay. This is not quite right though, so I'm going to delete this guy and then I'm going to fiddle around with this a little bit more. Remember, you don't have to match your source material perfectly. You just want to make it look right. Which sometimes is harder than you think. Fair enough, we'll make this guy smooth too. That should help us out a little bit. You usually want to make the node smooth as late in the process as you can, because if you have any weird disturbances in the lines, then they really show up easily later on when you click on Smooth Node. This guy here isn't quite right because we kind of want this thing to go all the way down there. We have our snapping on, so that should help us out a little bit. And then what we're going to do is we're going to alter these guys manually too. So we need to kind of move these guys around like this. Leaving these intermediate nodes actually makes it a lot easier to control what's going on. And then sometimes you have to turn it back on to say to yourself, does that really look like a good shape? Doesn't look too bad. So Control-Alt-C. Delete these guys. All right. One more to go here. I usually like to turn it off the layer when I'm working on this stuff just to get my hands on the source layer a little bit better. I used to use transparencies to do it, but I discovered it's just a lot easier to do it this way. You'll see that this doesn't quite meet up, so what we're going to do is we're going to do that, and then what we'll do is we'll bend this one out just slightly so it covers over any imperfections we have in that layer there. And if you look closely here, it's almost impossible to tell where they meet up. So that's cool, which is exactly what we want. Now we'll kind of do the same thing with these guys here and try to make them match up close to what we're interested in having them do. Except you'll note here that I kind of didn't get the shapes fully right, so we can fix that now. Well, it's just lots of fun bending the lines. It's actually quite relaxing to do this. Or definitely boring, depending on your viewpoint. Hopefully not, because you're watching this video. All right, we more or less have our eyelashes here bent in the right directions. Now we need to mate this up with the eyes. So we'll turn the eyes layer back on, and we'll see that this doesn't quite match up. So we're going to fool around with that until that path match up. This is where the snapping comes in very handy because you can really match this stuff up closely. You can kind of take both of these off to see where you're at. We do note that the eyelashes do kind of overlap a little bit on the eye. So that's probably acceptable, although if you're worried, you could always move it in just a tad. Of course, whenever you do something like that, then you got to fool around with everything else. This is where snapping can get annoying, so you want to turn it off in this case. I'll just do that by hitting Shift%, and that will turn it off for me. That's not bad. All right, so now what we have to fix up is these little guys over here. How are we going to do that? Well, you want to match this guy up, so you're going to want your snapping back on again. I've turned mine off inconveniently. So we'll snap this, and then what you can do is you can just kind of create a node here to snap that, and then delete this extra free node. Delete key. See, I tried to make it a corner node there. That actually didn't work half bad. Of course, I found sometimes at this point Inkscape likes to do silly things there. So it's probably better not to do that. Instead, we'll just smooth this line out gently. just far enough to cover over the eye white there. So you can't even tell that there's an imperfection. Ta-da! We have one eye completely finished. Now all you have to do is replicate the exact work we just did with the other eye, and you're done. The only peculiarity here is that the eye white over here, you see the entire eye white, whereas over here you wouldn't. And so in that case, we're actually going to leave the eye white kind of spilling out exterior to the eye. It's kind of going to look like this. But that's okay because we can always fix that later on. And I'll show you how to fix that too. But for now, this is Dash of Salt signing off.